For a number of environmentalists, the countdown to the end of the world from the threat of climate change is on. British author and activist Zion Lights has taken the challenge to offer viable solutions to the doom and gloom surrounding climate alarmism and government mandates. She's also a former spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion UK on both radio and television between 2018 and 2020. Zion, thanks so much for joining us today from Exeter, England.
Thank you for having me.
So what's your perspective on the current state of global warming alarmism? How do you think it really affects the environmental discourse today?
I think the problem is that people have become very negative, and I don't think any problems are really solved by just focusing on the problem itself. I think we really need to think about solutions. And what you have is a whole generation now of young people with high levels of eco-anxiety saying that they don't see the point, that their futures have been taken away. We heard Greta Thunberg say this. And, this isn't a reason for them to fight back and to fight for positive change in the world, which is a real shame because actually some of the loudest voices in that area are those with the most powerful voices in the world. If you are from this kind of background like I am, grew up in the West, you're actually quite privileged and there's a lot that you can do. So I think the alarmist rhetoric is just actually preventing action from happening, even though perhaps the people that came up with the idea thought that it would alert people and push them into action. It's now become detrimental, I think, to the cause.
What are your thoughts on some of the young people I've seen that are actually throwing food at artwork and art galleries, or they're gluing their hands to a highway? I've seen some young people being hauled off the Autobahn so they're not killed. I mean, the Autobahn in Germany, last time I checked, there's not a speed limit, so that's pretty dangerous. What are your thoughts on some of those actions from some of these climate alarmists?
I feel sorry for them. I think they're being misled and they're being told that they have to put their entire futures on the line because the problem is that serious. And if they don't, then they're part of the problem. And so these young people are risking jail. They're risking, as you say, quite high risk, quite scary scenarios. Here they block roads, they hang from bridges. And they just, you watch videos of their interviews and they, I think they're kind-hearted people who really want to see change in the world, and they've been misled and they're anxious. They haven't been led towards solutions. They're being told that there's an apocalypse coming and that if they don't act, it's on them. And I think that's really quite dangerous messaging. And it's not solving the problem at all. It's not helping them. It's mostly just causing divisiveness. At least over here, people are getting very annoyed with them because they're just disrupting ordinary life every day. As I say, there are so many positive solutions that they could fight for if they put their energy in that direction. I think they'd be brilliant. But unfortunately, that scary narrative has really taken hold on a lot of young people now.
Oh yeah, you're seeing it all over the place. Now, Zion, considering your background in science communication, what evidence-based solutions do you believe can really effectively address climate change, especially in the context of nuclear energy?
So first of all, we've been sold a lie by the traditional environmental movement, which is that we can solve this problem by all addressing our individual actions and doing less. Now, it might be true if you have a really, really highly carbon intensive lifestyle, but that's a very small percentage of the population. Not going to touch that for the minute. But if you think about most of the things that we're being told to do, these are very, very small differences that they make to the world. Yes, you can recycle, and I do recycle. Yes, you can eat less meat, or you can drive less, or whatever. But it's a very, very small difference that's going to make, actually. And yet so many people who care have put their drive and emphasis and money into that. And it's kind of fraudulent, actually, because if you look at the actual problem, all we need to do is address our emissions. Bring down the emissions. We don't have to sacrifice our quality of life. We don't even have to sacrifice convenience to a large degree. We just have to bring down emissions. Now, that can be attained by large quantities of energy. Now, historically, that energy has come from fossil fuels because they are reliable, they've been cheap, they've been plentiful, and they enabled us to escape human poverty. Most of human history, we did live in poverty. Now we need another abundant energy source that isn't highly environmentally taxing, that doesn't create air pollution, doesn't drive climate change. That is nuclear energy. That's the scientific consensus that it's needed to decarbonize. The only large industrialized nations in the world that have managed to do without nuclear is just Norway, basically, because they have a lot of hydropower, which is a geographical advantage. Most places don't have a lot of hydropower, and even other countries that do, like Sweden, still have a lot of nuclear energy in the mix. And Sweden actually is now building new reactors as well, because they're thinking ahead to the fact that actually we're going to need more energy to get out of this crisis. It's not just about nuclear either. You think about a lot of the other solutions. What are we doing? We're switching to electric vehicles. That requires more energy. We're going from gas boilers to heat pumps. That requires more energy. We are an energy-rich civilization, and we will remain an energy-rich civilization. We only need to make sure we meet those needs and increasing demands instead of telling everyone to live with less.
So how do you put people's fears at ease when it comes to nuclear energy and nuclear power, that we don't have another Chernobyl incident?
So, I mean, Chernobyl is a really good example, actually, because it will never happen again. It was an RBMK reactor, which they're not built anymore because it was known that this was a flawed design. It was a flawed design, but the Soviet Union created it, so they wanted to use it, and they built lots of them. Well, actually, nobody builds these anymore, ever. And the few that are still in existence in Russia, they've been upgraded so they can't explode. But that flaw was that that reactor was capable of exploding. Modern reactors cannot explode. So it was really a one-off situation. Equally, there's a problem that the government at the time the Soviet Union didn't want people to know what had happened. So they brought people on site to try and clean up the problem, who were then exposed to more radiation, when actually what they should have done is completely evacuate the area, and they would have prevented a couple thousand deaths. But even then, I think you have to look at it in context. So what I usually say to people who are afraid of nuclear energy is to look at the statistics, because the numbers really speak for themselves. The number of deaths from nuclear are a few thousand in total across history. That includes Chernobyl, that includes Fukushima, and that includes 3 Mile Island. The latter two, nobody died because of the meltdown. A lot of people were afraid and panicked, but nobody died because of the meltdown. So actually, then if you look at deaths from fossil fuels, talking about air pollution alone, there's at least 9 million deaths a year attributed to burning fossil fuels. I mean, this is a no-brainer, even if you don't care about climate change. I mean, I think we should care about climate change, but even if you take that off the table, we need a clean source of energy that still provides us with our high-quality lifestyles, and that is nuclear energy.
Solar and wind power often hailed as green energy solutions at different sources. Zion, what are your thoughts on these renewable energy options?
Well, I think the term renewables is a bit of a misnomer because it lumps together so many different things. As I said, hydropower is very reliable, very powerful, also has an element of danger. Everything has an element of risk. If you think about the Bankyo Dam disaster in China, there's a few 100,000 people died, again, more than from any nuclear incident ever. I'm not saying don't build it. I'm saying there's always a risk. So a lot of people think they like wind and solar because there's less risk. But the problem is, A, they still require a backup energy source for when it isn't windy and sunny. So that's either going to be fossil fuels or nuclear. B, there is a risk if you're trying to put your whole energy grid in one basket, like Germany did with Energiewende, which was their plan to phase out coal, phase out nuclear, and just do renewables. They spent billions and billions, tens of billions on building wind and solar power. And then what happened? What's happened now? They've had to reopen their mothballed coal-fired power stations because it cannot be done. This transition cannot be done with intermittent energy. People don't want to live with intermittent energy. People don't want to have to ration energy. And frankly, we need lighting and heating and air conditioning, and for our hospitals to work, and all of these ordinary things that we've become very used to but are very energy dependent. So they've now backtracked on that, but you do have other countries now, like Australia, trying to follow a similar plan. They're closing their coal-fired power stations. They're not lifting their ban on nuclear energy. They're instead trying to do just wind and solar, and they say the batteries are great. If you look at the batteries they're buying, they're spending billions of pounds on 3 big batteries. And let me tell you something, each one of those batteries will only store electricity for 3 to 4 hours. That is the science. Anyone's free to look that up. It's a mistake, actually, and I think it will put a lot of people out of jobs, which will just make them fight against an energy transition that does need to happen. It'd be much better to do what they're doing in America, where they're shifting over coal workers to a nuclear industry and making sure they still have the jobs. They use existing infrastructure. This is a good, healthy energy transition, but let's not rely too much on intermittent sources of energy.
So if you were to put them beside each other, solar and wind versus nuclear power, how would they really compare in terms of sustainability and efficiency?
So, I mean, they can work well together, and there's lots of countries that have managed that, like France. And I tend to represent the scientific consensus, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the same report, the same body that puts out the report saying we need to act on climate change. They've also said we need a combination of nuclear and renewables to make this happen. And I think part of it is that there's a social license for wind and solar that isn't necessarily there for nuclear in a lot of countries. In some countries it is, but in some there's still an uphill battle. So to some degree, it's easier to get them built. Also, the upfront cost looks very cheap if you don't factor in the backup, if you don't factor in the fact they need to be replaced every 20 to 25 years. But that is creating a lot of waste, and that does mostly go to landfill. Now, some people will say, they'll argue with that and say, but we can recycle them. Well, then we should, and that should be a cost that's in that original kind of, when you put that money forward for wind and solar, it should be costed in, and it's not, because actually they do tend to end up in landfill sites. So what we're doing is we're choosing something that lasts for for less long, that takes up an infinitely, significantly bigger amount of space than nuclear power plants because they require a lot of land. And then they need replacing after a couple of decades, and then that goes to landfill sites. So actually, if you look at it really honestly, it's not the greener option at all. This is, again, kind of fraudulent claim that people are making. I think having a panel on your house that helps provide some of your own electricity, that could be quite a decent way to go ahead if you're willing to then replace that in 25 years and make sure it's recycled. But otherwise, you're better off having a nuclear reactor down the road, providing good, clean, unionized jobs for people, and that will produce a lot of energy with a small amount of land, using a small amount of space for a lot of people for 60 plus years. In fact, in Finland now, they've just extended their 60-year reactors so that they will run for 80 years in total. I mean, that's a lot of bang for your buck, I think.
Speaking of big bucks, let's circle back to nuclear energy here for just a moment. And Alberta Premier Daniel Smith here in Canada was talking about the potential of nuclear energy for our future, but it's quite costly. A lot of investment is needed, and it takes a lot of time to build these nuclear power plants here. Now, in your view, what are some of the big misconceptions surrounding nuclear energy?
Well, so I think one of the conceptions is what you've just outlined. So the cost and the time to build. So the average build time in the world of all the reactors ever built is 7.5 years. That means, yes, some, like in Britain, by the way, we're taking quite a long time. We've had a lot of issues with losing workers and Brexit and then the pandemic. It's taking a long time to build reactors that in South Korea, they're taking only 3 to 4 years to build. So South Korea is a really good example as well, because after they built the reactors, they found that each one, the price of the unit comes down because they just take the workforce and put them on the new reactor. It's like making a Lego model, and they just churn these things out. And now they've struck a deal. They just struck a deal with the UAE, where COP28 is currently being held, where they went, we have no industry, we have no nuclear expertise. How do we build reactors? So South Korea went in, sent a load of engineers, set up an industry from scratch, and built 4 reactors. The 4th one's just come online. Now, these nuclear power plants have taken under a decade to build. And I'm talking about from the conception, setting up the industry. The actual reactors took 5 to 6 years. So it can be done quite quickly. And remember, yes, all right, solar and wind, you could do that much quicker, but you'd still need something as a base load backup for that. You'd still need nuclear or fossil fuels in the background. This is just completely 100% reliable electricity. And yeah, now in the UAE, 25% of their electricity needs are being met by these 4 reactors. So they're kind of going, oh, that was great. And now we have this incredible expertise and all these engineers. Maybe we should build more and export to the regions around us because they really understand the value of clean energy.
Now, you were involved with the group Extinction Rebellion. Zion, can you explain what that is?
So Extinction Rebellion was founded here. It was primarily an direct action, as we called it, based group where we would take actions to bring public attention and government attention to our 3 demands, which were declare a climate emergency, make commitments to net zero, and basically political revolution. I'll be honest. The 3rd one, which was a shift to citizens' assemblies from the current system, but it's basically political revolution, which I always argued with as not really relevant to climate change. What they say is that the system created climate change, so the system has to change. Anyway, this group really took off here. I was asked, I wasn't there at the conception, but I was asked to be a spokesperson, and I agreed because I felt that they were getting a lot of positive attention at that time, and I thought this could be a real good moment for change. And if I don't do this, other people will go and do these important television slots, and they might misrepresent the data. That in the end, I ended up leaving because other spokespeople were doing exactly that. And I think that does more harm than good. But the movement itself, this is where ideas like net zero and climate emergency and the term climate crisis have come from. They've all come from this group, which has been very powerful all around the world. So I did a bit of work with them for a little while, but I think that they should change direction and focus more on solutions.
Now, you emphasize questioning everything and encouraging people to really think for themselves, Zion. How can we navigate the conflicting information about climate change and really make wise, informed decisions?
I think it's important to look at the official body. So I look at things like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. You can look at communications from the United Nations. There are lots of groups The IPCC is really important because it is the kind of top scientists working in these areas, the top climate scientists and other areas of science as well, crunching numbers and putting that data in reports and regularly updating those reports. Now, they're quite dry and most people wouldn't read them. So the problem is we rely on journalists and other people and people, who just put videos online or write articles, who interpret this their own way. And you'll get people on both sides, some saying it says it's the end of the world. Actually, no, it doesn't. It has an entire chapter on mitigation and how we can fix this. Some say it's not alarmist enough. There's a lot of people on either side, but ultimately these scientists don't have any vested interest. They're just crunching numbers. And they are saying in these reports that actually there's a way out of this. And it does say that we need a lot of renewables and nuclear to do that, to achieve it. And it does say things like, there are areas where we could reduce energy use, but this is not so much in people's everyday lifestyles as it is things like insulating homes. And a lot of these things are just common sense that we should be doing anyway, that really contribute to having a strong, healthy population and a strong economy. So I would point people in that direction to look at what the data says, or to look at what those scientists are communicating themselves, because they can be much better at explaining the numbers than lay people.
Zion Lights is a British author and activist known for environmental work and science communication. Zion, thanks so much for joining us today from the UK.
Thanks so much. It was a pleasure.